The scent of damp earth and rotting lilies always brings me back to the day I buried a man I had already spent 2 years trying to erase. Grief is a peculiar thing when mixed with absolute betrayal. You do not mourn the person in the casket, you mourn the time they stole from you. Richard's sudden demise left a gaping void, not of love but of unresolved legal battles, two illegitimate children from separate mistresses, and a pair of former in-laws whose sheer audacity could suffocate a saint. The nightmare should have ended when the dirt hit the mahogany lid. Instead, it merely transferred ownership. My name is Evelyn. At 46, I had survived a crumbling marriage, raised two brilliant daughters, and was just beginning to find a fragile peace in the quiet company of a man named Elias. Elias owned the sprawling artisan market down the street from my house. He had calloused hands, a laugh that felt like a heavy blanket on a cold night, and a frustrating habit of knowing exactly when I needed a glass of wine and an hour of silence. He was supposed to be my fresh start. Thomas and Martha, my late husband's aging parents, had other plans. They were in their late 70s, though venom preserved them with alarming efficiency. Despite inheriting the entirety of Richard's hidden assets, the very funds he had siphoned away during our unfinished divorce, they set their sights on my home. The legal threats arrived first. Demands for full custody of my teenage daughters, Maya and Chloe, under the guise that I was an unfit, grieving widow. When the courts laughed them out of the building, the harassment shifted. They wanted to move into my guest wing. They insisted I owed them for the tragedy of losing their son, conveniently ignoring the fact that his infidelity had already shattered our family long before a sudden aneurysm took his life. The boiling point arrived on a Tuesday. It was Chloe's 15th birthday, a milestone meant to be celebrated with spun sugar and careless laughter. Elias had invited us to the market after hours to pick out a cake from his bakery. The air smelled of toasted almonds and vanilla bean, a sweet sanctuary from the suffocating weeks prior. Chloe was admiring a display of hand-poured candles when the shadows fell over her. 6 women. They moved in a rigid, terrifying unison, clad in pastel cardigans and smelling overwhelmingly of peppermint lozenges and righteous judgment. They were the apex predators of Thomas and Martha's conservative church congregation. Before I could cross the aisle, the tallest of them, a gaunt woman with eyes like polished coal, cornered my daughter. "It is a sin," she hissed, her voice loud enough to echo off the vaulted wooden ceilings of the market. "A mortal sin to turn your back on your own blood. Those poor little boys are your brothers. Your refusal to embrace them is deeply unchristian." Chloe shrank back, her shoulders curling inward, her eyes darting frantically toward me. These women were chastising a child for refusing to play happy families with the toddlers born from her father's affairs. The ceramic mug of coffee in my hand shattered against the cobblestone floor. The liquid splattered hot and dark, but I barely registered the burn on my ankles. I crossed the distance in 3 strides, stepping squarely between my trembling daughter and the pastel-firing squad. "Step away from her," I said. My voice did not rise, it didn't need to. The quiet menace in my tone caused the gaunt woman to blink, her confidence faltering for a fraction of a second. "We are simply delivering the Lord's truth," another chimed in, adjusting her spectacles. "Your in-laws are weeping for the cruelty in this family." "My former in-laws," I corrected, leaning in so close I could see the powdery foundation settling into the deep wrinkles around her mouth, "are harboring the funds of a serial adulterer. If you speak to my daughter again, I will ensure the Lord's truth is the least of your concerns." The women sputtered, clutching their quilted handbags, preparing to launch a secondary assault. They were interrupted by the heavy, deliberate thud of a steel-toed boot. Elias stepped out from behind the bakery counter. He didn't yell. He merely wiped his flour-dusted hands on his canvas apron, his dark eyes locked onto the intruders. "This is a private establishment," he said, his voice a low, rumbling baritone that left absolutely no room for negotiation. "You have exactly 10 seconds to find the exit before I have you escorted out for trespassing." They left in a flurry of indignant whispers, their heels clicking furiously against the stone. Once the door swung shut, the silence in the market felt heavy. Chloe buried her face in my shoulder, shaking. I wrapped my arms around her, kissing the top of her head, my own hands trembling with a rage so potent it tasted like copper on my tongue. Elias walked over, quietly sweeping up the broken ceramic of my coffee mug. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He simply poured a fresh cup of chamomile tea, pressed it into my hands, and let his fingers linger against mine. His touch was warm, an anchor in the storm. "They won't come back here," he murmured, his thumb brushing my knuckles. "I'll make sure of it." "It's not enough that they stay out of the market," I whispered, staring at the closed doors. They need to stay out of our lives. The following evening, the true depth of Thomas and Martha's deception revealed itself. Elias had come over to help me patch a leak in the kitchen sink. Maya, my oldest, came downstairs, her laptop glowing in the dim light of the living room. Her face was entirely drained of color. "Mom," she said, her voice hollow, "you need to see this." I wiped my hands on a towel and walked over, Elias trailing closely behind me. On the screen was the private Facebook group for Thomas and Martha's church. Martha had posted a sprawling, multi-paragraph essay accompanied by a heavily filtered photo of herself looking mournful. I read the words, my stomach twisting into tight, painful knots. She claimed I was leaving them penniless, hoarding Richard's wealth while they struggled to feed themselves. But the true horror lay in the second paragraph. Martha had woven a magnificent, deranged lie regarding the affair babies. She claimed that Richard and I had hired a surrogate, but because the children were boys, I had heartlessly rejected them, forcing the burden of care onto her aging shoulders. The post had hundreds of comments, prayers for Martha, vitriol directed at me, demands that someone intervene to save those poor, abandoned boys from my wicked selfishness. I stared at the screen until the letters blurred. A soft, bitter laugh escaped my lips. They had rewritten history. They had weaponized their congregation, turning an entire community into a mobilized army against my daughters and me, all while sitting on $500,000 of stolen marital assets. "Unbelievable," Elias muttered, leaning over my shoulder. His chest pressed lightly against my back, a solid, grounding weight. "They're entirely detached from reality." "No," I replied, the cold clarity of purpose washing over me, extinguishing the last embers of my grief. "They know exactly what they're doing. They rely on the fact that I've stayed quiet to protect the girls. They think my silence is weakness." I turned to look at Elias. The soft golden light from the hallway illuminated the sharp angle of his jaw and the deep concern in his eyes. "Elias, do you still have access to that commercial binding machine in your back office?" A slow, understanding smile touched the corners of his mouth. "I do." For the next 3 days, my dining room table transformed into a war room. I unearthed the thick, heavy boxes of my unfinished divorce proceedings. Everything was there. The meticulously documented evidence I had gathered before Richard's aneurysm rendered it legally moot. I printed high-gloss, crystal-clear photographs of Richard with his mistresses. I pulled the financial records proving Thomas and Martha had quietly received massive wire transfers from offshore accounts just days before Richard's death. But the crown jewels of my collection were the text message logs, pages upon pages of printed conversations between Richard and his parents. In them, Martha complained about the mistresses asking for money. Thomas referred to Maya and Chloe, his own legitimate granddaughters, as ungrateful bastards who didn't deserve a dime of the inheritance. Elias and I worked late into the night. The scent of hot printer ink and the sharp snap of the heavy-duty stapler became the rhythm of our evenings. We drank cheap red wine, our knees brushing beneath the table. In the quiet moments between collating financial ruin and formatting textual exposure, we talked. Really talked. He told me about the wife he lost to illness a decade ago, the hollow years that followed, and the unexpected spark he felt the day I first wandered into his market looking for fresh basil. "You're terrifying, you know that," he murmured one evening, sliding a stack of freshly printed bank statements across the mahogany wood. "Are you backing out?" I challenged, raising an eyebrow over the rim of my wine glass. Elias chuckled, leaning across the table. He reached out, his rough thumb gently tracing the line of my jaw, sending a sudden electric jolt straight down my spine. "Not a chance, Evelyn. I've never been more captivated." By Saturday night, our work was complete. 20 pristine, professionally bound books sat in a neat tower. They were identical in size and weight to the standard hymnals used at the local parish. I had even sourced identical dark blue faux leather covers, stamping a subtle gold cross on the front of each. Inside, however, there were no hymns, only truth, raw, undeniable, and exceptionally well-indexed. Sunday morning broke crisp and clear. The church service began at 9. Elias and I arrived at 8:30. The heavy oak doors of the chapel were unlocked, the sanctuary empty save for a few elderly volunteers arranging flowers near the altar. We slipped in through the side entrance, moving silently across the crimson carpet. We bypassed the front rows entirely. The front was for the devout. The back pews, the shadowy rows near the vestibule, were reserved for the gossips. The pastel cardigans, the judgmental whisperers who devoured scandal like communion wafers. With practiced efficiency, we slid the blue binders into the wooden racks attached to the back of the pews, seamlessly replacing the actual hymnals. 20 bombs armed and waiting for a curious hand. We didn't stay for the service. We walked out into the cool morning air, the heavy oak doors closing behind us with a satisfying click. Elias offered his arm and I took it, a profound sense of lightness settling into my bones. We drove to a diner 2 towns over, ordered pancakes and waited. I didn't need to be in the room to know exactly how it unfolded. I had attended that church long enough to know the rhythm of the congregation. At precisely 9:15, the pastor would ask the flock to turn to page 42. Hands would reach into the wooden racks. Leather covers would flip open. Instead of sheet music for Amazing Grace, they would find a high-resolution photograph of their grieving, pious widow's deceased son, entirely unclothed in a hotel room in Vegas. They would turn the page and find Martha's venomous text messages calling her own bloodline bastards. They would see the bank statements, the undeniable proof of their wealth, the absolute fabrication of the surrogate story. The fallout was spectacular, swift, and absolute. By noon, my phone began to vibrate. It didn't stop for 3 days. The church Facebook group descended into absolute anarchy. The pastel cardigans, armed with undeniable proof of their own manipulation, turned on Thomas and Martha with the ferocity of starved wolves. The very people who had cornered my daughter in the market were now demanding public apologies from the aging hypocrites. Thomas and Martha attempted to deny it, claiming the binders were the work of a jealous, deranged widow. But you cannot argue with bank routing numbers and timestamp text messages. The pastor, deeply humiliated by the desecration of his service and the sheer scale of the deceit, formally asked them to seek spiritual guidance elsewhere. They were quietly, but firmly, excommunicated from the only social circle they possessed. They now live in complete isolation. The calls demanding my house ceased entirely. The threats of custody vanished into the ether. They are trapped in a sprawling home bought with stolen money, surrounded by the deafening silence of a community that finally sees them for exactly what they are. As for me, I sold the house that held Richard's ghosts. Maya is thriving in her first year of college, and Chloe just started working weekends at the artisan market, learning to bake sourdough from the man who quietly helped us reclaim our lives. Elias and I are taking it slow, building something entirely new on a foundation of absolute honesty. We spend our evenings in his kitchen, the smell of roasted garlic and fresh herbs replacing the scent of damp earth and rotting lilies. Sometimes, the greatest act of love you can perform for your children isn't shielding them from the darkness. It's showing them exactly how to drag the monsters out into the light. Truth is a weapon, heavily weighted and terrifying to wield. But when you wrap your hands around the hilt and swing, it has the remarkable ability to cut through the thickest webs of deception, leaving nothing behind but clean air and quiet peace. If someone ever tries to back you into a corner, remember this: the most devastating revenge doesn't require raising your voice. It only requires printing their own words, binding them in faux leather, and letting their own community read the fine print. Always keep your receipts, stand your ground, and never let anyone rewrite your history. If you enjoyed this story of justified retribution, make sure to hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and share your own stories of dealing with toxic in-laws in the comments below. Until next time, stay sharp and protect your peace.